All right, the next section we're going to do here is going to be about the Chinese and Soviet alliance. So we know that one of the US's biggest fears in this period was that China would turn communist, become great friends with the Soviet Union, and that together those two countries would equal and rival the US and Western Europe's alliance. Because the Soviets and Eastern Europe alone just weren't enough. Okay, they weren't going to be able to be powerful enough. But if you add China, now we have something that's closer to equal, not economically, but with China's population, it's much closer to equal. We're going to leave it there. When China gets involved in the Korean War, which we're going to discuss in our next chapter, China actually fights the US in the Korean War. They literally put troops on the floor who fight US soldiers, and they push the US back. The US was going to take all of Korea. And this scares the US even more. Now they're willing to use violence against us. In the 1960s, though, China and the Soviet Union, they start to have problems, okay? China didn't always agree with the Soviet Union. They thought that the Soviets should be trying to spread communism all around the world, that there should be a more worldwide attempt to spread communism. They didn't like how the Soviets handled some of the situations in Czechoslovakia, in Cuba, even the way they supported the northern Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. I mean, they certainly didn't like the way they handled the invasion of Afghanistan, which we're going to get to all of these. But really, I think the biggest problem of all was that the Soviets didn't help the Chinese get Taiwan back. And I don't know if Taiwan was historically Chinese, but remember the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek moved to Taiwan, and the Chinese thought, hey, look, ally, let's put our army together. The Soviets had a much bigger army. The Soviets had nuclear weapons, okay, at this point. And they say, let's go squash out these nationalists who live in Taiwan. That island right there, let's take a look here. I showed this to you earlier, but here is big communist China, and here's little Taiwan and a bunch of these islands. And by the way, these islands, this is still an area of dispute. The South Chinese Sea, you'll hear it talked about sometimes, where in this area, the Chinese are trying to take control over this area, take control of the oceans with its improving military. Today, I don't know today who is more powerful, the Chinese or the Russians. I mean, the Russians historically had this massive army and this huge nuclear stockpile, but economically, they're not where China is. Where China is got a really strong economy and is growing quickly, and they're building their military incredibly quickly. Maybe they're passing the Soviets for the #2 military in the world. Of course, the US is miles above. But the Chinese are starting to gain control over this ocean, which is right off their coast. So, but the US has historically controlled it. The US has been so powerful for the last 70 years. But this is a sticking point between the U.S. and China, and the Chinese thought, hey, let's just squash them out and take this island, Taiwan, and the Russians wouldn't help them there. I don't know if the Russians were aggressive enough for the Chinese, so they have issues, and the Chinese, some people in China, right, are seeing that Mao, look, maybe Mao did a really good job. In the Chinese Civil War, and even in the period before the Chinese Civil War, when he was fighting it out with Chiang Kai-shek in the Long March, he was a hero, right? He is a hero to some in China. But the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were such huge disasters and failures that there were people in China saying, I'm ready to go a different way. And as Mao got older, they start pushing him to now open up the door to relations with the United States. And in 1972, U.S. President Nixon visits China, and it opens up that door. He goes to the Great Wall of China. I think he says something like, "This is a great wall." Maybe he even named it. I don't know, honestly. Um, I've heard stories, but it's interesting too about Nixon, because Nixon is kind of got a really bad rap in the U.S. and maybe for the right reasons, right? I mean, I don't want to get too political here, but Watergate happened under Nixon. It was the greatest scandal in U.S. history. Um, Not including anything that's happened recently. We don't have any historical perspective on the events of the last 5 to 10 years. We're not going to try and judge, but certainly Watergate has been viewed as the greatest scandal in U.S. history. And then, of course, there are like the stories of him using the Justice Department to fight his personal battles. He was like spying on Martin Luther King and like John Lennon of the Beatles. Nixon was doing a lot of dirty stuff. But you know what? The good stuff he did doesn't get enough mention, and this deserves mention. This was a really important moment, opening up the door to the U.S.-Chinese relations. He also invented the EPA. He arguably did some good things. And he also pushed the war on drugs, arguably some really bad things. Anyways, I'm going down a different road, but I digress. The U.S. and China open up relations in 1979. China refuses to sign the Sino-Soviet Treaty. And since then, the U.S. and China's relationships have been growing. Now, there are still sticking points between the U.S. and China, and I pointed that out in the South Chinese Sea. They are our greatest economic rival, and they have a really quick growing military. Our last president had the tariff battle with them and accused them of doing all sorts of things. But China is slowly turning away from communism. And over the last 40 years, we've seen China go from a dead, strict, crazy communist country to a country where arguably in the cities it's very capitalist and very modern. So as we said in our studies, 1980, China has opened the door to the West, with the US being its leading representative, and China's going to start to modernize. It's going to start to capitalize. And although capitalize, that's a bad use of the word, it's going to start turning more capitalist. And although they're not going to look towards democracy at all, and there are these crazy stories about how, like, if you Google democracy in China, you don't get anything on Google. Like, they block a bunch of stuff. They do open the door to capitalism. And when you get yourself economically tied together with other countries, it's tough to ever fight a military war with them because your economy relies on them. And the US and China's economy is very tied together over the last 40 years. So this is an important moment here we're talking about it, as China turns communist and kind of turns back to the US, who, by the way, was China's great friend in World